The sun bled across the desert, staining the sand in shades of gold and sorrow. Wind swept through the barren hills, carrying whispers of prayer and pain. A young Apache widow moved through the emptiness, her breath shallow, her body trembling from both birth and betrayal. Blood still stained her legs beneath the worn buckskin skirt. The marks of new life mingled with the cruelty of her people's judgment. They had cast her out for birthing twin daughters, calling them a curse, an omen of hunger and death. She had pleaded for mercy, for time to heal, but the council turned their faces away. Only the echo of her infant's cries answered her. Now she walked beneath the dying sun. Two newborns pressed her chest, their warmth fading fast. Her arms ached from the weight, but her spirit refused to bend. Behind her stumbled two small girls, no older than 6 and 5, their little faces streaked with dust and tears. The older carried a thin blanket. The younger clutched one of the babies when her mother's strength faltered. Their bare feet broke the crust of dry earth, leaving faint prints that the wind quickly erased. The land stretched endlessly ahead, red cliffs, sparse mesquite trees, a vulture circling high above. The widow looked once toward the horizon, as if hoping to see her home one last time. But only memory remained, the rough voices, the turned backs, the final command. Go and die away from our sight. She had been a wife once, loved by a warrior who never returned from battle. Now she was a ghost, her beauty dimmed by exhaustion, her body still young, but her eyes carrying centuries of sorrow. Night came swiftly, cold and unkind. She found a hollow between rocks, laid the twins close, and covered them with her shawl. Her hand shook as she touched her older daughters' faces. They were brave, far braver than she. The eldest hummed softly, the melody thin but steady. The widow smiled faintly, whispering a blessing in her tongue. Then she looked toward the stars, the same stars her husband once taught her to read like a map. They blurred now, not from distance, but from tears. Hunger pressed hard. Her milk had dried days ago. The girls' lips were cracked, their bellies hollow. When the wind shifted, it carried the smell of smoke, far, faint, human. She wanted to follow it, but her legs no longer obeyed. She tried to rise, failed, then fell forward on her knees. The babies whimpered. The older girls tried to lift her, their tiny hands desperate and trembling. Go, she whispered, barely a sound. If I cannot walk, you must. Carry them. Find someone kind. The elder child shook her head violently, tears shining in the moonlight. But her mother pressed the smallest bundle into her arms. The girl obeyed, not from understanding, but from love too deep for words. Together, they began to walk, 2 children and 2 newborns, wandering through a world too large to care. By dawn, the widow lay beneath the shadow of a dying tree. Her body was failing, her mind slipping between dreams and waking. She saw her husband there, his figure bright against the light, calling her name. She reached out, whispering a prayer she no longer remembered the meaning of. Then came a sound, the distant rhythm of hooves. The wind quieted. The birds fled. A rider appeared over the ridge, his silhouette cut sharp against the rising sun. He rode a dark horse, its mane wild, its pace steady. The cowboys saw the figures first, 2 little girls stumbling across the sand, their dresses torn, their small arms carrying swaddled shapes. He slowed, dismounted, and approached with cautious disbelief. When one of the girls looked up at him, he saw the face of courage and terror in a child's eyes. Easy now, he murmured, his voice rough but gentle. He crouched, offering a canteen. The eldest took it, then turned to give the first drink to her baby sister before taking any herself. That simple act struck him harder than any sermon could. He followed their gaze and found the mother beneath the tree. She was barely breathing, her hair tangled with dust, her skin pale as ash. Yet when he knelt beside her, she opened her eyes. They were dark, bottomless, filled with pain and pleading. She tried to speak, but her lips were dry. He lifted her head, let a drop of water fall between her lips. Slowly, she formed words. Please give them food, save my daughters. The sentence broke halfway, carried away by the wind. He looked at the children, for little lives born into suffering. and something shifted inside him. He had lived rich once, owned herds and land, but wealth had never filled the silence in his heart. He'd buried a wife years ago, lost himself in labor and loneliness. Now looking at this woman, he saw not a stranger, but a mirror, another soul who had lost everything except the will to love. He stood, scanning the endless land. No village in sight, no wagon trail near, only wilderness and the faint promise of his cabin half a day's ride away. Logic told him to turn back, to save himself the burden. But as he looked again at the small hands clutching each other, the thought withered. He took off his coat, wrapped the newborns first, then lifted the widow in his arms. She was weightless, fragile as a broken wing. The older girls followed without question. He mounted, pulling them close before setting the horse into a steady pace toward the mountains. Dust rose behind them, glimmering gold in the morning light. The widow stirred once, her head resting against his chest. "Why?" she whispered, so faint he almost didn't hear. He looked ahead, the wind cutting through his hat brim. "Because no one should die alone," he said softly. The desert stretched before them, a sea of silence and light. Behind, the trail was already vanishing, swallowed by wind, forgotten by the world. Hours passed. The woman's breath steadied against his heartbeat, her children safe within the folds of his coat. The mountains began to rise, pine trees breaking through the red dust like the first signs of hope. When they reached the river bend, he halted to rest the horse. The older girls drank and gathered small flowers from the bank. The widow opened her eyes, weak but alive. She tried to speak again, but he hushed her gently. "Save your strength," he murmured. "We're not far." She nodded faintly, watching her daughters laugh for the first time in days. Her lips curved into something that almost resembled peace. But as the cowboy turned his gaze toward the horizon, he saw storm clouds brewing over the ridge, thick, gray, and heavy. He tightened his grip on the reins. The sky darkened fast, wind rising like a warning. He glanced at the woman, then at the small faces depending on him. There was no turning back now. The storm would break before they reached shelter, and somewhere in that gathering thunder, both their lives were about to change forever. Snow fell softly through the pines, veiling the world in white silence. The cabin stood alone at the edge of the wilderness, smoke rising from its chimney in slow, curling ribbons. Inside, the fire burned low but steady, its glow brushing the rough wooden walls like the touch of a warm hand. The cowboy sat nearby, his hat resting on the table, his eyes half-lidded from a long night of watching over the fragile lives he'd carried through the storm. The Apache widow slept on a cot near the hearth, her skin pale as candle wax, her breathing shallow but even. The twins lay beside her, wrapped in the cowboy's coat. The older girls, curled on a blanket in the corner, slept with their arms entwined as though afraid that even dreams might steal them apart. The cabin smelled of smoke and wet wool, of life clinging to survival. When morning light slipped through the shutters, the cowboy stirred the fire and poured water into a tin pot. He'd been alone for years, so long that words had become strangers. Yet as he looked at the faces of those 4 little girls, he found himself speaking to them softly, telling them nonsense stories about wild horses and lost stars. They didn't understand every word, but the sound soothed them. They giggled faintly, and in that sound, something inside him unclenched. The widow woke to the smell of broth simmering. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion shadowing them first, then fear. She tried to rise, but her body betrayed her. The cowboy was beside her before she could speak. He handed her a cup, his voice low and careful. "Easy now. You're safe here." She hesitated, her pride and distrust warring with exhaustion. Slowly, she drank, the warmth spreading through her trembling hands. "My daughters," she whispered. "They're fine," he said, sleeping still. "They've eaten." Her eyes softened. She looked around the cabin, her gaze landing on the old rifle above the mantel, the saddle by the door, the row of boots near the wall. Every object spoke of a man used to silence, not company. "Why help us?" she asked quietly. He didn't look up from the fire. "Because I could." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was the only one he had words for. Days passed. The snow deepened, burying the path that led down the valley. The cowboy chopped wood while the girls watched from the window. The widow began to walk again, slow steps at first, her strength returning like dawn. She mended torn shirts from his trunk, washed dishes in melted snow, and hummed lullabies that filled the cabin with an unfamiliar peace. At night, when the wind howled and the roof groaned, he found himself listening, not to the storm, but to the soft cadence of her voice. It had the tone of the earth itself, something ancient and tender. He learned fragments of her language, enough to understand when she called the twins little stars, enough to make her smile when he mispronounced her words. The smile caught him off guard every time. He'd forgotten what gentleness looked like on a face. The girls grew bold around him. The eldest followed him to the shed, helping feed the horses, her small hands tossing hay with determination. The younger one tried to polish his boots, earning laughter from her sister and a soft chuckle from him. He hadn't laughed in years. The sound startled him, like hearing his own voice for the first time. In the evenings, they all sat near the fire. The widow told stories in broken English, tales of rivers that spoke, of ancestors who became stars. He listened as though every word might vanish if he blinked. Sometimes she paused, unsure of a word, and he'd finish the sentence gently, not because he knew her tale, but because he understood her silence. When the storm broke after a week, sunlight spilled over the valley, turning the snow to glass. The cowboy took the girls outside. They squealed as he lifted them onto his horse one by one, letting them feel its strength beneath their legs. From the doorway, the widow watched, her shawl pulled close, her expression unreadable. Gratitude warred with something deeper, fear, perhaps, or the faint ache of belonging she dared not name. That night, as the fire burned low, she found the courage to speak the truth that had lingered between them like smoke. "My people will not take me back," she said. "They think I am cursed." He looked at her, eyes steady. "Do you believe them?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, but I fear what comes next. If others find us here." "They won't," he said, though he knew it was a promise he couldn't keep. The frontier had long memories and little mercy for a man sheltering an Apache woman. Still, something in her posture eased. She turned her gaze toward the flames, and he watched her face, not with desire, but with a kind of awe, as if she were the first living thing he'd seen in color after years of gray. The days that followed settled into rhythm. The widow began baking bread from his old flour stores, laughing when the dough rose too much and spilled over. The girls filled the cabin with laughter and noise, a sound that transformed the space from loneliness into life. The cowboy found himself fixing the roof, cleaning the barn, repairing the fence, things he had neglected because it hadn't mattered before. But peace, he knew, was never meant to last on this land. One afternoon, as he carried water from the stream, he noticed a trail of smoke in the distance, not from his chimney, but from another fire down the valley. It was faint, but deliberate. Someone had been near. He said nothing that night, but his hands were restless as he cleaned the rifle. The widow sensed it, her eyes following him with quiet worry. "Is danger coming?" she asked softly. "Maybe," he answered. "Sometimes the world doesn't like what it can't explain." She looked at him for a long moment, the firelight flickering across her face. "Then we will explain nothing." Her voice carried no fear, only resolve. He realized then how much she had changed since the day he found her, no longer broken, but burning with quiet strength. Later, when the cabin had gone still and the children slept, he stepped outside. The snow reflected the moonlight, blinding and pure. Behind him, through the small window, he saw her sitting near the fire, rocking one of the twins. The sight struck him harder than he expected, that fragile image of warmth against the cold world. For the first time in years, he felt not alone, but responsible, bound not by pity, but by something deeper. The future was uncertain, the past unforgiving, but tonight there was a woman inside his home who trusted him enough to close her eyes in peace. He looked toward the distant ridge, where the faint glow of another fire still lingered against the dark horizon. Someone was out there, watching or passing. He couldn't tell. But as the wind shifted and carried the faintest echo of a horse's cry, a chill threaded through him. He turned back to the cabin, the snow crunching beneath his boots. Inside, the widow's shadow swayed gently with the firelight, and for a fleeting moment, he wished that time itself could stop. Then, from far off in the valley, came a single gunshot, sharp, distant, and deliberate. The gunshot cracked through the valley, distant yet sharp enough to still every living thing in the cabin. The cowboy's hand froze on the latch as the echo faded into the mountains. Inside, the widow looked up, her body tense, the twin in her arms beginning to cry. The older girl stirred, frightened by a sound they didn't understand. He met the widow's eyes through the dim light, and no words were needed. Danger had found its way to their quiet world. He stepped outside, rifle in hand, scanning the ridge. Snow glittered under the moon like a field of broken glass. The sound hadn't repeated, but the air itself had changed, no longer peaceful, but waiting. He stood still for a long time, listening. The forest answered with silence, except for the low creak of the pines. When he returned inside, the widow was already standing, shawl drawn tight, her gaze steady and unafraid. "Someone out there?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Maybe hunters. Maybe worse." Her expression didn't waver. "Then we stay ready." There was no panic in her voice, only a weary calm that came from years of surviving what should have killed her. He admired that. He always had. The night dragged on. Neither of them slept. He sat near the fire, rifle across his knees, while she kept the twins close. At dawn, frost covered the windows like white lace. The girls woke to the smell of smoke and fear. He forced a smile for them, told them everything was fine. But as he opened the door to fetch wood, he saw tracks, boots, not moccasins, circling near the shed. Fresh. The snow still loose around their edges. He brought the widow outside. Her breath caught when she saw them. She didn't ask who. She already knew. Settlers. Men who hated what they didn't understand. By midday, 3 riders appeared from the south, rifles slung, eyes sharp with curiosity that bordered on malice. The cowboy went out to meet them before they reached the porch. The widow stayed inside, holding the children close, watching through the window. The tallest rider dismounted, his smile narrow as a blade. "Heard you've been keeping company with a wild woman, Will. Thought you'd gone soft out here." The cowboy said nothing. His voice, when it came, was calm. "You heard wrong." The man spat into the snow. "We saw her. Apache. You know the law. You keep her here, folks will start thinking you've turned." The cowboy's grip tightened on his rifle. "You rode all this way to gossip?" The man's smirk faded. "No. To warn you. People talk. They say she's cursed. Bad luck follows her. You should send her off before she brings it here." Something old and bitter stirred in the cowboy's chest. He remembered the day he buried his wife, the way people whispered pity behind his back, the way loneliness grew in those silences. He looked at the man squarely. "You ride home and tell your people I don't take orders. Not from cowards who hide behind rumors." For a moment, no one moved. Then the rider laughed, a short, ugly sound, and swung back onto his horse. "Suit yourself. But when bad luck comes knocking, don't say we didn't warn you." They rode off, their laughter fading into the trees. The cowboy stood motionless until even the sound of hooves disappeared. Inside, the widow waited. When he entered, she spoke softly. "You should not have angered them." "They were already angry," he said, "at what they don't even know." She looked at him for a long time, her dark eyes filled with something between gratitude and sorrow. "I have brought you trouble." He shook his head. "You brought life." That night, the snow began to fall again, thick and endless. The world outside vanished into white. The girls slept piled together like kittens. The widow sat by the fire, mending one of his shirts, the fabric trembling between her fingers. He watched her, feeling the weight of everything unspoken between them. "You could still go," he said quietly, "when the weather clears." She didn't look up. "And go where? My people think me dead. The white towns would sooner hang me than feed me. I have nowhere but here." He hesitated. "Then stay." The word came out rougher than he intended. She finally lifted her gaze, searching his face. There was no pretense in his eyes, only a quiet plea, not of ownership, but of shared survival. Slowly, she nodded. Then I stay. The days that followed were fragile but full. The tension that had haunted them began to loosen. The girls filled the cabin with laughter again. The cowboy taught them to ride the gentle mare in the corral, their giggles echoing across the snowfield. The widow learned to make coffee, wrinkling her nose at the bitterness, but smiling when he laughed. Yet beneath the peace, a shadow lingered. The riders had not returned, but their word stayed. The cowboy knew the frontier's cruelty well. Mercy was not a virtue it often practiced. He'd seen men punished for far less than compassion. One evening, the widow found him outside repairing the fence. The sky was red with sunset, the air sharp with pine. She stepped beside him, her shawl fluttering in the breeze. "You still look for danger," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Habit." She tilted her head, studying him. "You fear losing what little peace you built." He drove the last nail, then leaned against the post. "Maybe I fear deserving it." Her eyes softened. "You saved us. You deserve to live without ghosts." He looked at her then, really looked. The scars on her hands, the quiet power in her stance, the way her voice carried both sorrow and hope. And for the first time, he let himself imagine a future. A real one. That night, while the children slept, he brought out a small carved ring from a drawer. Rough, shaped from pine, unpolished but honest. He placed it in her palm. "It's not much," he said, "but it's made by my hands. I thought maybe." She closed her fingers around it, tears glinting in the firelight. "You ask me to stay as wife." He nodded. She looked down at her sleeping daughters, then back at him. "Then, yes, I will stay. As wife. As mother. As woman who owes her life to kindness." The moment was silent but full. The fire flickered, painting them both in gold. Outside, snow fell softly against the window, wrapping the world in peace. Weeks later, spring began to thaw the valley. Grass returned, green and tender. The children played in the field while the cowboy mended the roof. The widow stood at the door, her belly just beginning to show, a quiet promise of new life. He looked at her, smiled, and in that simple exchange lay everything words could never hold. Far off, a hawk cried over the mountains. The sound carried like a prayer. The world had not forgotten its cruelty, but within that small cabin, love had taken root, fierce, unashamed, and free. And though the wind still whispered warnings through the trees, the man who once lived alone no longer feared it. Because some storms, he had learned, were worth riding through.